The Pay It Forest Coalition convened in June 2009, and over the past 10 years, we've been involved in 5 different landscape scale restoration projects. I think over the years, there's always been sort of tension between outcomes and outputs, and that tension may have increased recently with the emphasis nationally on increasing timber harvest and fuels management. So what I'd like to do in this presentation is suggest a way to approach these projects to make sure that there is reasonable emphasis on both, on landscape outcomes and commodity outputs. And I'm going to explore the relationship between the two from the perspective of being investors in forest restoration. Here's an interesting round number, $80 million. Where did that come from? Well, I tallied up the federal funds from fiscal years 2010 through 2017 that have been invested in the 3 CFLR landscapes within Idaho. So this does not include any of the matching dollars. It's just the federal funds, both from the CFLRP program as well as line items in the Forest Service budget. So I think it's safe to say that part of the role of the collaborative is to be outcome-based investors. The recommendations for priorities and recommendations for restoration ideas have a significant impact on the amount of money allocated to various treatments. And as we know, the responsible official is actually the decision maker. The collaborative group is sharing ideas and priorities through the recommendations that they offer. The interdisciplinary team is intimately involved in the project design and the analysis of environmental effects, and the public can comment at all the phases of the NEPA process. I'm going to use Lost Creek, Boulder Creek, and view it in the rearview mirror, the 80,000 acre project within the Weiser Little Salmon Headwaters landscape. I will be referring to the proposed action and the alternatives, so just a quick refresher on that. B is the proposed action with the purpose of moving vegetation and watersheds to the desired condition. There are also recreation facilities and improvements in the proposed action. In response to comments during scoping, 3 alternatives were developed. C became known as the watershed or conservation alternative. D was in response to comments about is the benefit of vegetation treatments achieved from the intensity of the treatments? Should there be more activity? And E was responding to the question of, well, are we really spending too much money? Are the costs too high for the restoration benefits? So there is what will follow will be a 4-part or 4-component approach to analyzing a project. At the center is the landscape outcome, followed by 3 economic goals: efficient allocation, appropriate scale, and community stability. I should mention that in the draft DEIS, there was one economic goal of community stability, and I think you'll see the difference here as I go through the composite approach of all 3. Beginning with the outcome, I think it's important to, as we all know, to recognize the 2016 restoration policy that was adopted nationally by the Forest Service. Within that policy, the restoration definition is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that is degraded, damaged, or destroyed, the 3 Ds of restoration. Degraded, damaged, or destroyed with respect to a reference condition. So a landscape outcome, even though this is an economic analysis, is a physical metric of change. It's not a dollar objective. And I am selecting one from the draft DEIS, and I'll explain why I've done that. But the main point here is that this ought to be a collaborative decision. So in order to help select a landscape outcome, the production economics principle of capacity constraint plays a role. And this is a concept in economics that when you're managing a system, often there is a single factor or constraint that impedes the management of the entire system. And in order to effectively improve the situation, you need to ensure that you're adequately addressing that constraint. The chart is one that Keith had presented at the IFRP conference 2 years ago, I think. And it's from a USDA publication in 2015, documenting the increase in wildfire costs as a proportion of the federal budget. So in 95, it starts out at 16% of the national budget. It increased to 52% in 2015, and the projection is for it to increase to 67% in 2025. This has a huge impact on, or has had a huge impact on, all other resource programs within the Forest Service. So fire management has increased over 300% during that time period. The examples here of other resource programs have decreased anywhere from 24 or 14% to 46% over that time period. So based on that, from the draft DEIS, as a landscape outcome, I've picked acres of improved fire regime. And I think the bar chart will help explain why. The chart from the left side to the right side increases in fire regime severity. The dark green bars are historic acres, and the light green are the acres within the project area in 2012. Now, even my untrained eye can look at that and conclude that the project area is degraded, and I think one can conclude also or project that untreated there is a risk that it will change from degraded to damaged or even destroyed. Destroyed being acres that will not return to a forested state post-disturbance. So there is a risk, definitely a risk to communities within the wildland-urban interface, but also a risk to our other resource interests of the coalition: wildlife habitat, watershed condition, and recreation and access. So I'm going to proceed with that metric for a landscape outcome, improved fire regime acres, and address it with 3 economic goals: efficient allocation, appropriate scale, and community stability. And each one of those goals will have a relevant performance metric. So to begin with efficient allocation, the concept here is that the supervisor in his record of decision is making an allocation of stands to treatments. The desired outcome, or the expected outcome, is acres of improved fire regime. There is a cost to each of those treatments, and for vegetation for the total cost, I'm including vegetation treatments only, net of revenue, and the ID team used a tool to calculate the net present value of the costs for the vegetation treatment. So the metric is average cost per acre of each of the alternatives. In the chart, on the x-axis are the acres of improved fire regime, and on the y-axis is the discounted cost of the vegetation treatments. So recalling that B is the proposed action, both B and alternative D are at the high end for acres improved and have relatively similar total costs. The watershed improvement alternative improves fewer acres and at a higher cost, and alternative E, that was attempting to reduce costs, actually ended up with higher cost per acre and a significantly reduction in acres of improved fire regime. The range from alternative E to alternative D is about 16,000 acres difference within the 80,000 acre project area. So the second economic goal is appropriate scale, and in this goal we are focusing on the output, the commodity production. And over the decades there's been a lot of research in forest management to address sustainability of timber production, a sustainable harvest over time to make sure that you aren't cheating future generations in terms of harvesting to the point where you are decreasing available harvest in the future. This is an investment decision of a sort, or of a different sort. It's a sale of an asset. You are divesting it. And to evaluate this, I am using a relatively simple tool, but I think still a valid one, that compares over the 10-year project period the projected growth harvested versus the growth retained only on management prescription classes 5.1 and 5.2 within the project area. And the metric is the opportunity cost of the harvest deferred. In the chart, to explain what is going on the x-axis is the percent of growth retained. So a good example of that is the no action alternative retains 100% of the growth increment expected within the 10-year period. On the y-axis, 100% harvest of the growth increase would be roughly what a private landowner would be expected to do, or at least that's how they are taxed within the state of Idaho if you are a private landowner owning more than 5,000 acres. And then each of the action alternatives are displayed on this line. And it's interesting to note that all 4 action alternatives are less than 50% of the growth increment. Well, there are a variety of reasons why that should be true. The most obvious is that the coalition did not reach consensus on appropriate harvest for some potential vegetation groups. That would be one reason. There are also forest plan constraints that would be limiting the amount of harvest. And I think it is of value to compare the relationship between the action alternatives, and also to recognize that in each case, the harvest deferred has a cost associated with it, and it is an opportunity cost that reduces potential income that could be applied to other restoration actions. I do want to add one very important caveat, is that the acres that are harvested should only be those stands that will post-harvest contribute to the landscape outcome of improved fire regime acres. Third is community stability. As I mentioned, this was the only economic goal within the draft DEIS, and the tool that the interdisciplinary team used is IMPLAN, Impact on Planning and Management. It is an analytical tool that helps estimate the annual jobs as a result of the money invested and the annual income. So the metric in this case is the annual income, and you'll note that there is a significant difference between the lowest and the highest, and that would essentially be $10 million over a 10-year project period. This is an important goal, obviously. It's very important to members of the coalition and to appropriators in Congress, but I am suggesting that it ought to be third after appropriate scale and efficient allocation. You could have a project that is completely unrelated to restoration and yet supports a large number of jobs and an annual income. So combining all of those metrics, the improved acres, efficient outcome, appropriate scale, and community stability, this chart is an ordinal ranking of those metrics in terms of being first, second, third, or fourth. And I think one way to interpret this chart is that you're on a foot race from right to left. The vertical line is the finish line. You'd prefer to come in first rather than fourth. And so the colors indicate the economic objective for each of the collections of bars. The bars are grouped by alternatives, the proposed action, the watershed alternative C, D, are you doing enough, and E, are you really spending too much and not receiving the restoration benefit that was expected. So this is I think an interesting comparison. Alternative D ends up to be not only one for improved acres, but also in terms of the relative cost to achieve those improved acres. It has the least amount of harvest or growth deferred, and it contributes the most to community stability. The watershed alternative also has an interesting outcome in the sense that in terms of these four metrics, it is tending to be at the lower end of the response. And I think, as you all remember, the record of decision was sort of based on input from the coalition, became kind of a smorgasbord approach where there was a combination of items from each of the alternatives. There was more watershed restoration work done, and as well as increased restoration harvest. So in summary, outcomes or outputs, I think for the restoration investor, the answer ought to be yes, with one major caveat that the landscape outcome ought to be the driver for the project, the physical measure, and in this case, in my example, I'm using the acres of improved fire regime. However, that doesn't eliminate by any means the commodity output, but the commodity output does need to be the appropriate scale. And the major caveat is that stands that are scheduled for commercial harvest should be contributing or need to be contributing to the landscape outcome, and they provide the benefit of reducing the cost. It improves efficient allocation from the revenue from the stumpage sale, and also contributes to community stability. In closing, I think one way to effectively address the tension between outcomes or outputs, with the recent emphasis on timber harvest and fuels management, is to ensure that the project design includes a very clear definition of the landscape outcome, an outcome that addresses the capacity constraint of the forest. And in addition, that the environmental impact statement broadens its horizons for economic analysis to continue to include community stability, but to ensure that that analysis also addresses efficient allocation and the appropriate scale for the commodity output.